Also those of you, who are watching us online as well, very glad that you're able to join us today. So many thanks. This is a Bruegel event. We're going to be talking about compensation between content and application providers versus network operators, which is very much an evolving discussion. As most of you, probably all of you, will be well aware, there's been a very intense debate over the past year, largely recapitulating an earlier debate from 10 years ago, arguing that increasing traffic volumes are related to increasing costs, and that somehow there should be a different mechanism for compensation than that which exists today between content and application providers versus network operators. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm very pleased and honored that we have some really excellent speakers with us, very carefully chosen. We're all very senior researchers who've been dealing with these topics, for many years, and happily none of us is doing current work for commercial parties. So my hope was that we could, on this topic, so my hope was that we could have a deeper and more founded and more objective discussion than what's frequently been the case in sessions like this. Now, the couple of questions that I posed in the introductory material are ones I'd sort of quickly walk you through once again, and I'll actually be doing the, for us, somewhat unconventional step of having a moderator also put up a few slides. But really, questions like internet traffic has been growing. Is the growth pattern different than it was in the past? How different? What does that matter? Does increase in traffic correspond to increase in cost? What does this imply also for costs for the content and application providers? Who bears responsibility for any increase in traffic? And also, what do other changes in, for example, corporate taxation, how do those interact with the things that we're going to be discussing today? So those are the main things that I was hoping that we would be able to take up. Our speakers today will be Johan Ketelaar, I hope I'm pronouncing that close enough. And Johan is a very experienced expert. He works for Axera today. He also has many years of experience with the Dutch ACM. He has worked for Meta, and again, has a deep experience in these issues. In fact, at Meta, he was responsible, I believe, for connectivity, so very much engaged in these issues. Ilse is actually an old colleague of mine from my former institute, the WIC, the German Wissenschaftliches Institut für Kommunikationsdienste. She's director of their Brussels office. Again, very deep experience in exactly these issues, which she'll be walking us through, and I think adding some perspective to the things that we're going to be talking about today. Now, we'll be speaking for hopefully about 45 minutes, at which point we'll be able to turn it over to you folks for question and answer. And also, those of you out there in Radio Land, you can also ask questions. We use a system called Slido, SLI.do, which you can access directly or from the webpage for this event. So you can be asking questions as well. And in addition to asking questions, you can also set an input that you like questions that others have asked. That helps me because the questions that get the most votes roll to the top of the screen, and it helps me to know which ones have interest from the audience. So again, I'd appreciate if you pose questions, but we won't take questions now. We'll take questions at the end of the session, and our normal practice is we take about 3 questions in a row and then give the panelists the opportunity to respond to those that they have something to say about. So that generally makes for an effective exchange. And with that, I'd actually like to move into a few comments that I've prepared. As I say, normally moderators don't do this, but I actually thought it might be useful to toss out some more detailed questions, both to the speakers and also to you, the audience. And so with that, a quick reminder first, a quick reminder first, which I can now give you, that we have a public consultation, a so-called exploratory consultation from the European Commission that's already out dealing not only with the question of compensation, but also with broader questions of really what's happening with the entire ecosystem. How should broadband be funded? What should be changed in regulation of content and of networks? But about half of the total text deals with the topic that we're mainly talking about today. And so really the questions I'll be posing are, what do we actually know about the issues that are being raised in that public consultation? And what questions is the consultation likely to answer? What questions perhaps is the consultation not so likely to give useful answers to? Now, one of the clear topics is a presumed increase in internet traffic. And I don't think anybody doubts that internet traffic is growing. Internet traffic has always been growing. The real question here is it growing at an accelerated pace? Is the growth somehow different from what was experienced in the past? These data that I just put up on the screen come from Ericsson. It's their estimates of mobile data. And the growth is very clear in the blue bars, but equally clear is that the year-over-year percentage growth is declining. And that's actually been the case as long as I can remember. Previous Cisco VNI data, many of you will remember that, tended to show the same kind of trends both for fixed and for mobile over a period of many years. So what do we think is actually happening with traffic going forward? Clearly there was a bump for the COVID pandemic, but what do we think is the long-term trend and why does that matter? Another question that I'll be tossing out, and I know that Ilse in particular is going to have some things to say about this, is what's the actual link between traffic growth and cost or cost growth? The public consultation with the Commission more or less takes it as an article of faith that more traffic means more cost. In the past, that actually wasn't the case. I took a very detailed look at this back in 2012. If you look at the graphs on the right, they come from a market research firm at the time, and these are old data, but the blue line going up represents historical and then projected traffic growth. So that was the projected traffic worldwide, clear upward trend. But the red line, based on data from the same consultancy, same market analyst, is my calculations on what this means for megabits, cost per megabit per second carried. And as you can see, it's declining at just about the same rate. And in fact, having worked out the math, it turns out that the traffic-based costs at the time were flat. Now, again, it's old data. That doesn't guarantee that's the case today. This is actually why I'm tossing out the question. But it's not an automatic presumption, I would say, that increasing traffic equates to increasing cost. Moore's law improvements could be canceling those out, as was the case in the historic past. This is a figure that comes from some work that I did with Lafontaine and Tirole years ago, but it tries to express precisely the internet interconnection system. And there, it has many characteristics similar to a two-sided market. I know that Johan has also looked at this environment as a two-sided market. There's some differences, but also some similarities. The two-sided platform arguably isn't any single internet service provider, it's the internet service providers collectively. And of course, their interests aren't aligned. And a main evolution that took place long after this analysis is that many of the network operators, many of the content and application providers, firms like Google, internalized the internet service provision function. They became their own ISP. It turns out that the economics largely work out the same as in this older result. And so the question I pose is, two-sided market, the point of a two-sided market is to bring the two sides of the market together. Nobody makes money unless everybody makes money. And a question then becomes, where do we ascribe cost causation in a system like this? It's not so straightforward. In fact, a very fine paper by Lafont, Tirole, and Gian argued that even in a case that we thought we understood pretty well, telephone calls, one can make a strong argument that the cost causation isn't solely the calling party. The receiving party also plays a role. If the receiving party didn't want the call, he'd hang up. So again, cost causation, I think, is a fundamental issue to take up. And net neutrality, relationship to net neutrality, another aspect that's been very prominent in the debate. As it happens, Ilse and I were principals on a study for the Commission. The study, I think, has not yet been published, hopefully will be out within days, but the Commission's response to it is, it actually turns out the linkage between the open internet regulation and this issue is less direct than a lot of people assume. The internet regulation, the OIR, doesn't really talk about interconnection. There's some BEREC guidelines that do. There's also a recital in the regulation that deals with it. And while I'm on the point, it turns out that the caps actually don't, in most cases, not in all, but in most cases, they don't qualify for what's called interconnection legally under European law because they typically are not themselves providers of public electronic communication. So again, open questions. Is there a link? What's the link? A last thought question I wanted to toss out is this relationship to tax, something that typically isn't discussed but seems to me to be an elephant in the room, is the question of the changes in corporate taxation. This is something that telecoms and content experts tend not to focus on so much, but it's important here. Some of you will be aware, I hope, of the so-called BEPS, base erosion and profit sharing tax reforms that have been worked out by OECD and also taken on board by the G20 countries. Now, exactly how these will play out in detail is still getting sorted. But the amount of money that we're talking about is substantial. We're talking about increased revenues and also transfers from existing countries to others that range over 100 billion per year. So these are non-negligible transfers. And the main function of this is to transfer cash from companies, a lot of whose assets are in intangible property, intellectual property that can be parked anywhere, for example, in low tax or no tax regimes. So that means it'll be largely the same companies. And a question that I then pose is, how does this revenue source relate to the others that are being discussed? Complicated question, I would argue. The slides, of course, will be made available. I provided some pointers to some of the literature, including reports that both Ilse and Johan have been involved in. And with that, I'd like to move the discussion over to Johan. Johan, over to you. And
yep. Thank you very much, Scott, for the kind intro and for setting the scene. Oh, let's see how this works. Is it working? This is yours. That's mine. Thanks a lot once again. Very happy to be here. Hello, everybody. As Scott said already in his intro, I will today talk about the work that we as Oxera have done on this topic, which was for the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. We did this study by the end of last year, and earlier this year we gave a presentation also here in Brussels, me together with my colleague Michael Weeks. So there might be a bit of duplication here for those who attended that presentation, but given that we have limited time here, I will today speak very briefly about most of the subjects that we covered during that presentation. And the report is publicly available, as is the economic model that we have used in there. So people should feel free to go there. And if there are additional questions coming from that, then please feel free to reach out to me or one of my colleagues. When we were approached by the Dutch ministry, this discussion was already starting, obviously. There was no proposal yet. There still is no official proposal yet. So we had to do a bit of discussing scope, especially with the ministry, about what we as Oxera could contribute to this part, given that there were a lot of presentations, statements out there. So we needed to be clear with them on what we would include in this particular study. We agreed on the following, and I think everybody who's here today or listening in today by now knows about it. So the basics is that we would work on an economic study about gaps content application providers paying to telcos in some way to network costs. And of course, we needed to cut it down to a little bit more concrete boundaries, but that was basically what we were trying to do. And I think by that we always and also need to be modest about using these kind of reports and models, because as Scott already pointed out in his slides, and Niels will present also later on, and Vic has done a lot of work on this, this is a highly complex environment, but I think it's very important to contribute in a multidisciplined way and in an evidence-based way, which was a little bit missing in all the contributions that we saw last year, and which was especially the goal of the Dutch ministry, to have more substance on this matter in the discussions that would follow and are still about to follow. So we try to play our part in that by contributing with this study. So when we dove a little bit deeper into the dynamics between caps and telcos, we thought it was important to focus on three main parts or buckets, you could say, economic buckets. And one was the static welfare effects of the proposals that were out there. The other was the dynamic welfare effects. And the third bucket that we considered important is to focus on the transaction or the regulatory costs that would come with a regime shift. I will explain this shortly, a little bit more in depth. Scott mentioned the open internet regulation. We deliberately didn't include the open internet regulation in our assessment. We don't think it's not important or something, but we wanted to have like a sort of greenfield basic economic approach, and we feel that discussions about open internet regulation are important, but they are also to some extent about non-economic subjects, fundamental rights, and you need to put these next to the economic study that we provide, and then it's up to policymakers how to combine these together with all kind of other elements, including the ones that Ilse will probably present later on, before you come to new policy proposals. But we wanted to play our bit in the purely economic assessment of the effects of such a payment that was proposed. Important in terms of scope, I said a little bit about it already, but this time a little bit deeper. If you are going to investigate the proposals or the suggestions that were out there, is who should pay. And I know that a lot has been said already about this, but it's not exactly clear what the proposal would be or what a final suggestion would be, but it's an important question to ask, because if you would argue that every cap or close to every cap would pay, then you've got a different discussion from if you would say that 5 or 6 large caps should pay. Then the other question is the structure of the payment. How would you set up a regime for payments? Would it be traffic-based? Would it be some subscriber-based? Would it be something different? And the third question, which is a little bit ignored, I believe, in the public discussion so far, is who receives the payment? As we all know, you've got many ISPs out there. You've got like incumbent telcos. You've got fiber-only ISPs. You've got like alternative operators, etc. When you talk about a regime change, you need to take these dynamics also into account. Now, after discussions with the ministry, we agreed on a base scenario, basically, where we said that an all caps pay scheme would be unworkable, as you can imagine, for all kind of practical feasibility issues. So we limited it to a few caps should pay, the large ones, which is also what you hear most outside if you see the proposals or suggestions made. And then the structure of the payment would be in proportion to traffic, which is also what most of the people out there are suggesting. And on the receiving end, we focused on the telcos in terms of the ones who own the network, but we didn't completely ignore the alternative players. We included them later on in the analysis in the more qualitative parts, which again is also an important thing to take into account. So if you read our report, don't only focus on the model that we built, always look at the other aspects too, the more qualitative statements. And it's a complex environment, as I said, but just looking on the model would be too narrow-sided. That said, we built a model, which I'm going to explain now. And the model is basically a static model, economic model, very basic. And we ourselves called it an illustrative calculation because it helps in the discussion, but it should never be presented as the ultimate model. Also because the inputs that we used can be discussed. We used the inputs from public studies proposed by Edno actually, but of course there could be a discussion about those inputs too. So the model itself is very helpful, I believe, but it should also be seen in the broader context of this paper and even beyond this paper. Scott said something about two-sided markets. I know that there are people out there who argue that you should even look at these markets as being two-sided. You could also argue these are even multi-sided markets with a lot of players out there and even more complex dynamics. I think this is all true to some extent. But also, given the approach that the Dutch ministry wanted to take here, we thought that for economic reasons, also to add economics into the broader discussion, it's important to take the model of a two-sided market. A two-sided market, as many of you might know, is complex, and the key feature of a two-sided market is that the costs and prices the prices on each side of the market are not per se related to the costs, because you've got like dynamic effects between the players, the agents of the markets, that might be beneficial, for instance, for both sides of the markets, which could lead to different outcomes and prices. You might even have like two-sided markets that we know where you have negative prices on one side and positive prices on the other side. So, but for this model, it's important to take this approach. Currently, we know that the market, as it has evolved to date, is more like a one-sided market with consumers paying for the subscriptions, and caps, typically, with some few exceptions here and there, don't paying for the network costs. This is what's going to be discussed and what we have analyzed in the paper. In theory, there could be benefits from going to two-sided markets, because there could be welfare gains that you don't achieve with a one-sided markets that could be tapped into. So I think initially to have this idea of investigating a two-sided market it's always a good thing to see if you can come to better outcomes. And especially with networks evolving, it's maybe timely to do these kind of assessments and to have these kind of discussions. But it's important to look at what the economic effects would be. When you look at the change to a two-sided markets, I mentioned it already in my intro, you should focus on mostly these three parts: the static effects, the dynamic effects, and the costs that come with such a regime change. I will very briefly go through some of the preliminary outcomes there, and because I want to allow Ilse also to take a bit of time. Do I have time? Okay, perfect. Yeah. So let me first focus on the static model. So this is the model that we built, and there we used the assumption that there are 6 caps contributing to what we call the traffic sensitive costs of the networks. And again, you can debate about how much of the costs are traffic sensitive, but we took the inputs from the Edno report, which was from Axon and Frontier, actually. Then we looked at the receiving end, where network operators received a per subscriber payment. Basically, what we concluded from that model, and we used 3 scenarios basically there, we saw that there are 2 effects, which are very intuitively, I guess, and which are also out there in the public discussion as we've seen it to date. You see on the one hand an effect on the telco side, where a contribution could and would lead to a positive effect, as long as it leads to lower broadband prices. That's a key issue here, because otherwise you don't untap the efficiency gains from these markets. So this is what you can compare with the waterbed effect, what you've also seen in mobile termination markets. But this time it's slightly different. If there would be a contribution and it would be passed on to consumers in terms of lower prices, and it would lead to higher take-up, which could be consumers, more consumers using internet, but also more data being used as a consequence, then it could lead to positive welfare gains. On the other hand, you've got the cap side, obviously, where the opposite is happening, because caps should contribute this time to telcos, and it could lead to welfare losses on their side. And of course, it's highly complex given the very different nature of the different caps, and each of them having different business cases and facing different competition-like constraints, etc. So it's hard to make like a one-size-fits-all calculation there. But therefore, we use the model with different scenarios, and you could overall see that there would be a welfare loss in all scenarios there. These need to be compared, right? You've got welfare gains on the one hand and welfare losses on the other hand, which is part of the model that we built. And overall, we saw that for all scenarios, basically, that the main effect of these kind of contributions would be more the nature of a transfer rather than being an efficiency gain. Again, you can argue all of the details, but I think the main conclusion from that one was that the overall welfare change is pretty limited. I think that's an important consideration. And there could be all kind of reasons to be in favor of such a transfer, right? But those arguments are more political of nature than economical. I think that's another important one, which is maybe related to some of the subjects that Scott explained. So that was the static model. If you look at the more dynamic impacts, this has more the nature of a qualitative analysis in our paper, actually. But the dynamic impacts are important. It's about the trade-offs, right? The effect of the static towards the caps is what will happen to the caps incentives later on. If they were to contribute, it could be that they will produce less content or there will be lower quality of content, but it could also be because caps investing in networks themselves, that there would be lower investments on that part of the caps investment side. That could be a dynamic result also from the regime change. Then the other question is, of course, about investments by telcos. And it is argued that there's an investment problem by telcos. I'm not going to judge on whether that's the case or not. What we did in our report is whether we looked at the question if the contribution would be imposed, if that would automatically lead to those investments being increased. And we found that there's no direct relationship there unless it is mandated by some kind of authority. There's no kind of automatic process that more contributions by some caps would immediately lead to investments. So I think that's an important one on the dynamic side as well. Then if you look at the third part of our paper, basically, which focuses on the transaction and the regulatory costs, we believe this is also an important one to take into account, because on the one hand, you've got welfare effects that I just explained. On the other hand, if you were to go to a regime change, you need to look at the costs of these changes. And there are many potential costs involved, and in our report we included a couple of them, but it's important to look whether these costs could be significant. And for this part, we didn't do a full quantitative analysis, so this is more like a qualitative assessment again, but I think it shouldn't be underestimated that those should be taken into account if you are considering a new regime. And I will briefly name a number of those, because I think it's important to go into this, and I have also seen that some of them are mentioned in the broader discussions, and I'm sure that in the consultation there will be more stakeholders reacting on this, but I think it's important also to mention it here. So if you were to change this regime, you're talking about markets which until now have not been regulated. And we found in our report, and I think there's agreement by most of the stakeholders, that if you were to impose network fees, that there should be some role for a regulator. And the regulator might be confronted with a lot of tasks, depending on the methodology chosen, but that's part of the unknown that we have today. We need to speculate a little bit. But if you take the methodology that we have included in our report, quite a number of tasks would be on the plate of the regulator. There would be all kind of cost assessment. You need to set prices also. You need to analyze the traffic streams, which could be highly complex. I won't go into the details of that. We didn't include it in the report, but I know that Vic, for instance, has done some work on those kind of more technical parts. And you need to verify those, and those traffic streams could also be different in jurisdictions, but also per telco, basically. So there's also a question how you would deal with that. And of course, there could be practical solutions, but if you would use all kind of averaging techniques or methodologies, there would be more risks of stakeholders or CAPs or ISPs even not agreeing with those because they wouldn't necessarily reflect the situation in that particular country or ISP. Then there might be more disputes that we have seen to date, which need to be settled. And I think there's an important dependency also with the regime, as we know to date, where NRAs or regulators need to do all the S&P analysis, because there's a dependency between this new potential traffic streams and the assessment of the S&P market reviews. That doesn't mean that it's not possible to do this, but it's important to take these into consideration. There are also potential competition issues that could arise depending on the regime chosen, because if you charge one cap and you don't charge another cap, there might be dynamics that are unforeseen and would distort the level playing field, so to say. There could also be other dynamics between caps offered by a telco themselves who might not be in scope, and competing caps who might be in scope. So all those kind of things we labeled under the term transaction costs, but are important to take into account if you were to assess a regime change. I think I'm coming to an end. The summary and the conclusions are here. You can read them, but I'll pass the word to Lisa.
If you want to just mention the conclusions, it seems a shame to skip the conclusions.
Yeah, I've told it already, but my slide is...
Okay,
I can do it. No. So the first conclusion is the static welfare effect, where we see that there are two effects basically. One on the cap side of the market, the other on the telco side of the market. On the telco side, it might be a positive welfare effect. On the cap side, it's negative. And those should be weighed against each other. That's purely the static. Then we've got the dynamic welfare effects, where you need to look at the investments and whether without a proper mandate, there would be a link between potential contributions and the investments. And then the transaction cost was the last part that I just mentioned already, should be taken into account too. So I think in sum, this is what I wanted to say, and of course I'm happy then to take questions later on.
Okay, thanks a lot, Johan. And then over to you, Ilse. Can we manage about 15 minutes? That'll leave us a few minutes for questions.
Indeed. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if this is working. Let me see if I can get to my slides. Whoop! It is working, and I think I accelerated too far. So, thank you very much for the invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to draw on a number of studies that have been prepared by WIC Consult. One of them is a rather significant study that colleagues of mine prepared for the German regulator, BNetze. There's a link to that study at the end of this presentation. But I'm also going to take the opportunity to draw on some other studies that we prepared on subjects like broadband costs and state aid, because they also seem to us to be relevant to this debate. I'm always told that when you want to find a solution, when you're thinking of introducing a policy, you should define the problem first. So, what is the problem in this case? The statement that we've heard is that caps need to pay their fair share. But fair share of what? Is it the traffic-related costs of the telecoms networks where they cause those traffic-related costs? Is it interconnection costs? Is it the cost of faster or more performant access technology, such as fibre to the home, or so-called full 5G, where you deploy 5G using mid-band and millimetre wave frequencies and you upgrade the core network? Is it taxes? Going back to a question that Scott posed earlier. So I'm going to run through a few of what WIC has found in relation to these questions, and I'm going to start, I guess, with the first topic. Is there a problem, effectively, with the way that transit and peering markets are working? And the slides I'm showing here come from the study that my colleagues prepared for the German authority, BEPS. I think a first comment to make, and this responds to one of Scott's questions, is that it is true that the volume of IP traffic is continuing to grow. So it did in the past, and that's continuing. Although it has to be said that the growth rates in the EU are flatter than they are in many places outside the EU. We're seeing rather stable annual growth rates of between 22 and 27%. It's also true that this segment, or the traffic, has become more concentrated. So 5 to 6 players account for more than 50% of this traffic, as we've heard from other sources. On the other hand, we can see that prices for transit are falling in relation to the bandwidth that's transited. We can also see that there's been quite a dramatic shift, although it's been gradual over time. We can see a shift away from the use of transit to peering in this section. When we talk about the degree to which prices are falling, we can see that they seem to be falling in line with the degree of cost reduction in core network components. And one of the things that WIC specializes is cost models, and we see that prices are falling around 20% per annum in terms of the bandwidth transmitted. And this you could term efficiency gains, and I'll show a diagram illustrating this effectively on the next page. What else is happening? We're seeing the internet turn from more of a hierarchical system to something that is more similar to a mesh on the same level. And we're seeing a lot more traffic being conveyed over so-called content delivery networks. So these are networks specifically designed to carry kind of content, especially from those 5 to 6 players who account for so much of this traffic. And in particular, we see a lot more development in on-net content delivery networks. So CDNs that are effectively hosted, co-located in major ISPs' premises. Globally, CDN traffic almost tripled from 2017 to 2020. In effect, what we're seeing is a lot of the traffic that perhaps was going over tier 1 providers' networks, as transit, for example, is now in fact going over networks that have been deployed by the CAPs themselves. And in fact, quite significant investments have gone into those CDNs. I only have data here from 2014 to 2017, but apparently there was an average annual investment of $3.6 billion in transport and $2.2 billion in delivery networks from CAPs. So the CAPs have been investing effectively in their own transit systems, and those are replacing perhaps some of the demand that might otherwise have occurred for transit via some of the larger telcos tier 1 providers. Well, who wins, who loses? It's mostly a win-win situation. We at least found this in the study we conducted for BEPS. Most ISPs welcome the idea that CAPs should co-locate their servers on their premises and improve the quality of video delivery to their customers. Nearly all ISPs permit CAPs to do this, but a few ISPs don't. One example is the German incumbent. Deutsche Telekom has rejected bill and keep peering mechanisms that are traditionally accepted by others, and instead prefers to monetize interconnection via transit pricing. In a sense, you can see why it might have an incentive to do that. But for many ISPs who are not in that position, in other words, without their own very significant transit network, they would benefit from cost reductions effectively. They have to invest less in their own core network if the caps are bringing the traffic to them. I said I was going to illustrate the efficiencies. It's interesting to see that when you look at investor presentations that telcos make to the markets, they tend to highlight the fact that even though network traffic is growing, and you can see that on the left-hand chart, the cost per gigabit has fallen faster, and they illustrate this on the right-hand chart. So this is data from Vodafone. So we seem to see rather different messages being given to investors where they're saying, it's okay, yes, there's more traffic, but we can take care of this, it's all right, than messages that are perhaps going to policymakers. So what solution is being demanded, at least by some larger telcos? They're asking to move to a solution which would effectively be sending party network pays. You could see this as somewhat of the reverse or contrary to the system with calls, which is the calling party network pay system. Of course, at the moment, transit and certainly peering is based on a bill and keep mechanism. First thing to say, with the exception of South Korea, which I will come to later, there is currently no regulation of IP interconnection in Europe or any of the other countries that were investigated for the study. There have also been very few disputes, even though arguably disputes of this kind could be addressed, in theory, under the EU telecoms framework. There is one exception there relating to Swisscom, but that is the only dispute that we found in the study. What happens when we look at the case where they did, in fact, introduce a sending party network pays principle, and that is South Korea? In South Korea, the government required ISPs to settle transit charges between themselves according to this principle. What we find in practice is that this seems to be linked to much higher transit prices. So in 2021, transit prices in Seoul were 8.3 times higher than in Paris, for example. We then see some incentive effects from doing this. Some Korean content and application providers reduced service quality to save on network charges. And Facebook responded by shutting down their cash service at Korea Telecom. So they stopped the on-net CDN business. And Netflix refused to pay as well. This would tend to increase the costs to caps compared with hosting in non-regulated markets. They end up needing to host it outside the country. And this also has an impact on quality. If you don't co-locate, if you don't have the on-net CDNs with the bill and keep principle, you will end up with higher latency and potentially also higher prices for the content that's being delivered. There was a later amendment to the Korean Telecoms Act, and in this, large caps were required to take service stabilization measures. You could see this as an attempt to address the unforeseen consequences of the action that had been taken earlier. And that would result in higher payments being made to ISPs. Where is this all headed? I mean, we need to look in the years to come. But potentially, it could lead to a decline in the diversity of online content, and potentially also lower infrastructure investments as a whole. I'm going to move now into perhaps the other part of the debate, because I've been focusing so far on the interconnection discussion, or rather the peering and transit discussion, and I'll focus on the access costs. So this is the second part of the what if. Should caps pay more of a fair share? Are they paying fair share towards access costs? By access costs, I mean the cost of fixed or wireless access networks. Now, WIC has done some work in this area as well. We estimate that around 174 billion euros of investment is still needed EU-wide to achieve the digital decade goals by 2030. However, big caveat here, This figure assumes the completely independent, separate deployment of fibre to the home networks, and also the separate deployment of full 5G networks, including network densification and the installation of fibre backhaul to support small cells, for example, when you're using mid-band frequencies for 5G. But you could reduce that amount. So those investments could be lower if instead of FTTH, you use technology such as 5G fixed wireless access in the most remote zones, because those are the areas where the access lines are extremely expensive when you're installing FTTH. And also if you deploy fibre and 5G in tandem, so you make shared use of the fibre lines, so you use the FTTH network also for 5G backhaul, you could save an additional amount. Another point that is worth stressing is that the fact that you need what sounds like a very large amount of investment doesn't mean that you need the same amount in subsidies. So many areas are economically viable. This is something, again, that we have estimated, and there will be a report released, I think, relatively shortly to explain how that was done. So the subsidy is only going to be a portion of that amount. Last but not least, there are already significant EU funds available to support telecoms infrastructure deployment. I think the last estimate suggests it was just under 20 billion euros have already been earmarked to support telecoms access deployment. And national funds are being mobilized as well. And we know this from a study that we conducted on broadband state aid. There might be some perverse effects if you're asking for caps to pay for the access network deployments of telcos. The first one is this. The provision of cap services, in particular bandwidth-heavy services, could possibly increase consumers' willingness to pay for gigabit services, for example, or perhaps in future even higher bandwidths. I mean, why else would somebody take a gigabit service if they didn't want to use some of these higher bandwidth streaming applications or other applications which are bandwidth intensive? The same applies, I would say, for quality assured 5G. If the applications are not there, which requires a higher bandwidth, then what's the point? Isn't the idea that if you really want these services, you would probably pay more for that? If that's true, then how should those kind of intangible benefits to telcos be taken into account? Another question is, and this is more, I guess, a distribution question. Many member states have already achieved quite extensive fibre to the home coverage. I mean, I'll give some examples: Spain, Portugal, Sweden, some of the Eastern European countries like Romania and Bulgaria. And this has happened without specific contributions from caps. What's proposed in those cases? Should there somehow be a rebate to pay for the investments that have already been made? Another point that I think is worth making is that more than half of the existing FTTH coverage in Europe, and I only have figures from wider Europe, is not by incumbent telecom operators, but by other players like alternative operators, cities and utilities. But they don't seem to be requesting specific subsidies from caps. Why not? When it comes to 5G coverage, we know from another study that we conducted that was published recently that many mobile network operators are planning to deploy 5G using mid-band frequencies, that's like the 3.5 gigahertz frequencies and so on, within the next 2 years or so. We also hear that demand is a key driver. In many cases, there's no explicit coverage obligation. But how could it be guaranteed that any funding received from the caps would be directed to expanding those investments? And would such targeting be efficient? And this is my last slide, really. It comes to the last question. Are caps paying their fair share of tax? I don't know the answer to this question, but what I can say is that caps should, of course, make a fair contribution to the tax base in the EU. It also seems evident that there's a need to address incentives that currently exist to engage in what I could call forum shopping, to report your profits in the most advantageous tax regimes. But as we heard from Scott, there are already changes to corporate tax payments proposed under the OECD Base Erosion of Profit Sharing Project, BEPS. And that could lead to additional tax payments from large caps to EU member states. Incidentally, not only from large caps, also from other multinationals, but I suppose that those would be amongst them. And when this occurs, that would replace the digital service taxes introduced in some countries, such as the 3% levy that has currently been imposed in France on gross revenues from major content and service providers. So we should really consider whether, once these levies are made, this leads to large caps making a more fair contribution in taxes than is the case today. And in particular, I think it would be useful to compare the contribution they make after this system with the contribution made by smaller caps which have a more restricted reach and therefore can't forum shop, and of course also telcos. So if this results, as it should do, in additional tax receipts, that could also support additional state aid for broadband infrastructure if there is a funding shortfall, which may or may not be the case depending on the country and region, and if allocation to broadband infrastructure would be the most efficient use of that money. Now, of course, that implies that the money goes to the government, and the government then decides what to do with it. But anyway, that's just one possible solution to this conundrum. Finally, but I suppose this would maybe be for you to look into once we circulate the slides. On the left-hand side, we've got a link there to the study that WIC conducted for the German Regulatory Authority on competitive conditions on transit and peering markets. We've also prepared studies on the role of state aid for the deployment of broadband networks. And the study that I've linked to at the bottom is one where we looked at the contribution of content and applications to willingness to pay. So, and also my contact details on the right if you have any questions or want to follow up. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both speakers. This brings us to our Q&A session. We've got time for at least one round, maybe more. I've got two great questions that came in via Slido, and I'd also like to take one question from the room, if we have one. Do we have a question in the room? I don't actually, I see one. Okay, Andre, please introduce yourself and your affiliation, even though I know who you are. The microphone is coming. I'll read out one of the other questions while we wait for that. One of the questions is, from an academic perspective, how clear, evidence-based, and transparent is the European Commission's questionnaire due process? So we'll come to that as one of the three after we get this one from Andre. Andre?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for insightful debate. I'm Andrzej Sokówka, and I'm part of Google policy team here in Brussels. I was wondering on the VIC introductory remarks, you mentioned the demand side of the debate, and I was wondering whether you have seen any examples of tools or ways or ideas that should stimulate the demand side. So the adoption of the new technologies, 5G, etc., with the SMEs or consumers. I think that you have mentioned that very briefly, so I was just wondering whether you have seen something interesting in this space. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll read out one more from the audience, which also got multiple votes. Is the recent Monopole Commission report providing useful insights on net neutrality impacts? And I'll take the liberty of saying a few words about that first because my fellow panelists may not have seen it yet. The Monopole Commission is an advisory committee. It's 5 senior experts who advise the German government on issues like this. And they just came out with an opinion on this fair share. It was rather skeptical of the notion of payments, of imposed payments, and they had 3 main grounds. First was that they see no abuse of a market position on the part of content and application providers. A second major finding was that they saw no evidence that imposed payments would lead to a better outcome than the current system, while at the same time they saw some risk that it would lead to Marktverzerrung, to disruption in the marketplace. And a third was very much in line with what Ilse just said. They don't see any evidence that current funding for broadband is inadequate to meet European goals. So that's the third question. And again, I'd invite the panelists then to respond to any of those three that interest you. Why don't we start with Ilse this time?
Okay. Well, I'll start with the one that's easiest to answer first, perhaps, and that's have we seen any measures that could stimulate demand? I think one of the interesting developments when we were looking at state aid policy is some countries which had made use of demand-side policy. In the past, it was mainly aimed at providing subsidies to deploy certain types of networks. But there are certain countries, I think Greece is one of them actually, where funds have been provided in the form of vouchers or other things for consumers to upgrade their connection. And that could be quite interesting, I think, because what we have seen in countries like Sweden and elsewhere and in France is that once you've experienced a faster connection and the services that you can get over that, very few people go back. So it's possible that having received that voucher in the first instance, you might be prepared to pay more after the initial voucher has expired. That's a tactic that could also probably be looked at by telecoms operators themselves. I'm not sure if I really want to comment on the other questions or have something useful to say, but maybe I could pass the poison chalice to you.
I think the questionnaire, maybe I can pick up on the questionnaire one. Yeah, I can see why Ilse doesn't want to comment on that one. I also don't feel very tempted to comment on the questionnaire. I think a lot of people have said a lot of things about the questionnaire. I think the more important question is what the Commission will do with it and what the process will be afterwards. I think that with our study, but I think overall it's important to have a proper evidence-based discussion if you were going to consider something which is potentially as drastic as what we are discussing today. I think you need to be evidence-based, and I think the first question is also if there would be a proposal for some kind of legislation, then how would it sit next to the existing regimes, right? We didn't include the net neutrality or the open internet regulation in our study, but it's an important given. It's there, and it's apparently going to stay there if I hear all the stakeholders, including the European Commission themselves. But I think more importantly, we are talking about markets here which are at the heart of the telecom regimes, where we've been looking at, I'm saying me as a former regulator also, in many years with evidence-based economic analysis of those markets and how they function. And when I was at ACM and even at the predecessor at Opta, we had very in-depth discussions about proportionality, effects, all those kind of things. And especially in the Netherlands, we had a national court who put very high standards for the cases brought forward by ACM and Opta in the market reviews. And I think for all the right reasons, because it's important to get regulation right. And I think if you are going to propose whatever you're going to propose in these markets, you need to at least have the same threshold in terms of process, open discussion about effects. And we try to contribute to some extent with our report. It's not covering everything, but I think it's an important addition, and I hope that the wider discussion will be evidence-based and open for everybody to properly comment.
Thanks, Johan. Well, maybe I'll take the poison chalice as well then. I have to say, I think there are legitimate things to discuss in this whole area about content application provider payments to network operators. Basically, the paper that I mentioned before, the one with Lafont, Tirol, and Ray, was specifically about what the effects of such payments would be. Many years ago, almost all experts expected that payments like that would be needed in order to enable differentiated quality within networks. So I'm not opposed to this kind of discussion, but I have to say, for me, the public consultation, this so-called exploratory consultation, was a big disappointment. It really reads like a strategy document masquerading as a public consultation. In many cases, the Commission frames questions in such a way that while it may be formally correct, there are what in terms of platform regulation we talk about as dark patterns. They make very clear what answer they're looking for. And to me, that's troubling. There are also a number of areas where they seem to take as an article of faith things that really ought to have been questions, such as, for example, the linkage between traffic levels and cost, or traffic-based cost, not really discussed and not raised as a question at all. So I think this could have been done better, more objectively. I mean, also the Commission's goals in many cases are quite transparent. The network operators would like to see payments flowing to them through a negotiation process. The Commission, it's fairly clear that their preference is to have a new source of taxation. And they seem also to be potentially raising some issues that were rejected years ago as being very bad ideas, like a European level authorization to serve as a telecommunications provider, or Europe-wide spectrum assignment. So I hope those aren't too serious, but the consultation really could have been better. Let's see, we are almost exactly out of time, and I know that Ilse has to go. I could take one or two more questions if Ilse can, or else Ilse says yes. If the events team doesn't mind, I could take one or two more. I have one or two more also here. Is there another question from the room? Well, I don't see one. The one that actually got the most votes here was, how would you assess the decision of the European Commission to outsource the evaluation of the questionnaire to an external consultancy? And another question on my list is, Axera speaks about welfare gain transfers from telcos to consumers. Where do you have evidence about potential fee being distributed to consumers? And of course, this is an important question. So I think that's a good one. For those of you, just to decode a little for the audience, when we distinguish between welfare transfers versus welfare gains, this is classic economics, Harburger triangle. The idea is that moving welfare around doesn't really benefit anybody. If, however, you get more consumption, then that's actually a net gain. So do either of you want to take either of those? I think especially the welfare gains.
I will take the Oxera question. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's a very important question, and I invite also the person who asked this to look at the model that we built. But I think it's a key fundamental principle, as you said, Scott, that if there's no pass on to the consumers, basically, if it doesn't lead, the contribution doesn't lead to lower broadband prices one way or the other, then there's no welfare gain to be untapped. So the question was, how do you make certain, or how do you know, or how do you prove that such a lowering of prices will take place? Of course, you never know before. It depends on a lot of factors. One important factor is the level of competition, obviously. And then still there are all kind of theories saying that in what circumstances there will be more pass on than in other circumstances. But in our model, we modeled that there will be some pass on which will create this welfare gain. And if this wouldn't happen in practice, imagine a situation where there would be a contribution and there would not be an effect on the retail side. I think there's something that needs to be investigated, right? Because then there's some kind of mechanism not functioning properly, which could be competition related, could be something else, but it's a key assumption to get some welfare gains at a minimum. But even in our model, then the welfare gains that needs to be put against the welfare losses on the cap side are pretty modest. But I think that that the welfare gains will be there. It could be by lowering prices. It could also be by higher take-up and the combination of those.
Yeah, and I guess I would add also, when we look at higher take-up for broadband, on the one hand, we have a Europe where Commission data would have argued for many years we have effectively 100% take-up, or at least 100% availability. And Eurobarometer statistics for many years have said that high prices isn't the reason why people don't have broadband. Typically, it's lack of interest or lack of training. Actually, one point to augment what you just said, there's a very interesting paper by Bruno Julien talking about the pass-through issues on the cap side, where he argues that the pass-through might be very different for caps that are advertising-driven versus those that get their revenue primarily from the consumer, like, let's say, Netflix.
Yeah. Yeah, in our model, we use basically two models. One is advertisement-based and the other is subscription-based, and the effects are different, for sure. With the subscription-based caps, there will be a more direct effect, obviously. If you take Netflix, for instance, you might imagine an effect on the subscription fee there. For the advertisement-based caps, it will be different, more indirect. But I think I mentioned it also in my previous comments. There could also be an effect in not only on the server side, but also on the investment side, because caps invest also in network quality, CDNs, those kind of things. There could also be an effect there.
Very good. Ilse, did you have anything to say? I was actually going to say, when we look at the question of farming the evaluation of responses out to a consultancy, I've done a fair bit of that in projects over the years. I suspect you have too. I don't necessarily see this as a problem. In some cases, it's actually good to take it out of the Commission's hands so that you get a more objective assessment. Ilse, any thoughts on that?
I think it assumes or suggests that they expect to receive lots of responses. Maybe they're busy on other things. I wouldn't read anything much into that. I'm looking forward to seeing the outcome.
Well, I think this brings us to the end of the session, and only 5 minutes over, so I don't feel too guilty. Look, I'd like the audience, at least those of you who they'll be able to hear, to express appreciation for our wonderful speakers. Thanks to the audience as well. And with that, I guess we can close. Thank you.